Good morning to our friends joining us from the United States, and good afternoon to those joining us from Europe. As the President and Chairman of the National Union for Democracy in Iran, it is my sincere pleasure to welcome all of you to this, our inaugural virtual forum. As you know, NUFDI is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization of Iranian Americans based in Washington, D.C., dedicated to supporting the cause of human rights, freedom, and democracy in Iran. As the situation in Iran grows more seriously by the day, and the Iranian people, of course being stifled by the Islamic Republic, look to those of us abroad to share their demands and their struggles with the world, we have launched this new effort to do our part to serve as a forum for the discussion of those most critical issues. On behalf of NUFDI, I would like to thank all of you for joining us today to discuss this important topic of the Islamic Republic's persecution of religious minorities, and would like to extend our special gratitude to our panelists, Mr. Mansour Borji, Hamid, Gharagozloo, and Ms. Marjan Keypour, for joining for sharing their time and review and views with us today. Now, I would like to ask and welcome our Policy Director, Mr. Kamran Concernia, to moderate today's panel. Thank you. Kamran, take it away.
Dr. Ganji, thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you for your leadership of NUFDI. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today, especially our distinguished panelists. Before we begin, some brief housekeeping notes. Please send your questions for our panelists throughout the discussion. If you're with us in the Zoom webinar, please use the Q&A function, and during the Q&A session, I'll be sure to ask your questions. If you're following us live on YouTube, please ask your questions in the comments section or tweet to us at NUFDIRAN using the hashtag NUFDIForums. From its very outset, the Islamic Republic in Iran has set for itself the goal of establishing an Islamic caliphate. Before ISIS, it was the world's Islamic State. It remains that today, but with an army and billions of dollars at its disposal. Standing in the way of that so-called Islamic State, however, are millions of Iranian religious minorities, including Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, Baha'is, Sunnis and Sufi Muslims, and many others. The regime has looked at these communities, long part of the fabric of the diverse Iranian nation, as undesirables. Unlike other societies in which, unfortunately, prejudice remains a part of social discrimination, under the Islamic Republic, it is enshrined in Iran's institutions and laws. The revolution's former chief prosecutor, Sayyid Musavi Tabrizi, said that, quote, "The Quran recognized only people of the book as religious communities. Others are pagans. Pagans must be eliminated," end quote. In response, the Islamic regime began an active campaign of persecution, discrimination, and elimination. Lest this once again fall into the false narrative of moderates and reformists, or confused as being the view of only a few most extreme regime insiders, a 1991 document from Ali Khamenei and then reformist or moderate president Hashemi Rafsanjani issued an edict on what they called, quote, the Baha'i question, that members of the Baha'i religious minority, quote, must be expelled from universities, either in the admission process or during their course of study, once it becomes known that they are Baha'is, end quote. To discuss that today and much further, we're joined by three distinguished panelists. Mr. Mansour Borji is the founder and advocacy director of the London-based Article 18, which promotes freedom of religion and belief for all, while focusing specifically on the persecution of the Christian community in Iran. Through research and documentation of the violations of religious freedom, the organization provides reports and analysis to policymakers, academics, and religious institutions globally. Mr. Hamid Gharagozloo serves as the U.S. representative of the International Organization to Preserve Human Rights. In that capacity, he liaises with the U.S. State Department, domestic and foreign government officials, non-governmental organizations, and various international media outlets to advocate for human rights in Iran. His work focuses particularly on the crimes perpetrated against the Gharagozloo Sufi community in Iran. Ms. Marjan Keypour Greenblatt is the founder and director of the Alliance for Rights of All Minorities, ARAM, a global network of activists which promotes human rights in Iran. As a former refugee, her career has focused on advocacy for human rights and the advancement of democratic ideals. She has advocated for Iran's minorities at the White House, the US Congress, the State Department, and the European Union. Thank you all very much for being with us today. It's our pleasure to host you. So I'll start with a few general questions for our panelists, and we'll just go in alphabetical order here, starting with Mr. Borji, then Mr. Gharagozloo, and then Ms. Keypour. Mansour, would you mind just giving us a lay of the land as you see it today when it comes to the regime's persecution of religious minorities? What are we seeing? And you may have to unmute yourself.
Sure. Let me first thank the National Union for Democracy in Iran for inviting me to talk about the situation of Christians in Iran. I also offer my respect to the honorable panelists. I think for many who closely monitor the situation in Iran, it's quite evident that the current regime is facing a really tough time globally in its international relations, but also internally with its own population. And the unrest continues to grow day by day, and as a autocratic and very dictatorship regime, they are very fearful of any organized groups or unions who may act to unsettle their regime. So therefore, they any groups that think differently or have a lifestyle even different to what the religious leaders, the ruling clergies in Iran deem acceptable, they're seen as a threat against national security or the regime's security, for a better word. So we see Christians being targeted, as well as many others, faith community, and also Shia Muslims who do not take the same official interpretation of Shia Islam in Iran. So Christians in Iran are also one of those targeted groups. We had a relatively brief pause in the height of coronavirus pandemic in Iran, with the arrests and detention of Christians because of the pandemic, of course. But then since the beginning of the Iranian year, around March, we have seen an acceleration in the number of people being arrested, and it seems that it's a business as usual. In fact, cases that we have documented thus far in August compares to the entire 2019 and even more. So just to put that in numbers, I think we have this year, so far this year, 85 cases of arrest, whereas last year 65, and that doesn't include cases that have not come to our attention and later on will emerge. So that's just generally what it looks like at the moment. People are being sentenced to very heavy prison sentences, 5, 6, sometimes 10 and 15 years in prison. And we have exile sentences, we have harassment of family members, we have denial of education, we have people who have been denied of employment. So all kinds of penalties to subdue this Christian community and stop their activities.
Thank you very much for the detail. Mr. Gharagozloo, would you mind giving us your view on what we're seeing today?
Well, I think what we're witnessing today is the beginning of the end of the regime. And as it gets closer to its end, it's becoming more dangerous and more vicious. In my opinion, the fact of the matter is that this regime does not discriminate against a specific religious minority group. It's all of Iranians. It's a despotic regime that expects absolute submission from its subjects. And it does that by two means. One is dogma and superstition. Early on, every Iranian for the past 40 years has been subjected to intense indoctrination and brainwashing, superstition, expecting them to abandon reason and rational thinking and defer for the slightest aspect of their life to mullahs. And if not, then you're subject to violent oppression. So basically, Iranians fall into three categories. One is those who have been brainwashed and submit to the wills of this regime. Two are the ones that coexist with the regime to survive or cooperate with the regime for their benefits. And third are others, other thinkers that are being punished, regardless of your creed, race, gender. Perfect example is Gharagozloo Sufis, population of 8 to 10 million Shia Muslims in a so-called Shia Muslim regime, or over 20 million Sunnis persecuted severely. Number of arrests, hangings, and murder of Sunnis is shocking. So it's not just a specific group. The crimes and atrocities levied against Gharagozloo Sufis, murders, imprisonments, torture, destruction of their homes and places of worship, stripping them off of every basic civil right, such as education, employment, has been levied against others, against Baha'is, Sunnis, converts to Christianity, traditional Christians, every other religious minority, Jews, Zoroastrians, Mandavis. And so the reality is that we all are in this together. Perfect example is women of Iran, half the population. They have been enduring severe, violent, vicious, misogynistic restrictions imposed on them by ideological dinosaurs, remnant of Umayyad dynasty. Prior to this regime, during Muhammad Reza Shah's reign, God bless his soul, women enjoyed equal rights as men, much more progressive than most of the Western countries today. We had fighter jet pilots that were women, judges, members of the parliament, heads of corporations, heads of institutions, university professors, physicians, physicists, mathematicians, every facet of life, they had a presence. And today, they have been reduced to mere position for enjoyment of men. Honor killing is one example. Women can be murdered by a male in their family, their husband, their brother, their father, even their cousin, or a 30, 40-year-old male can wed a 9-year-old girl who has had her menstruation. I mean, this is insanely sick. So it's not just Gharagozloo Sufis or Christians, it's the whole nation that has been oppressed. This is a perfect example. You see this? Women who have been disfigured by acid attacks, and the perpetrators have full impunity. That's what we need to concentrate. The whole nation is a prisoner of conscience in their own country.
Thank you very much. Marjan, would you like to add on and give us your view on how you see events in the country today, specifically vis-a-vis religious persecution?
Sure. And I want to thank you for your invitation and your leadership, and thanks to Dr. Ganji for his leadership, and for the activism of NUFDI and also all of my esteemed colleagues on this panel. Also, I want to send a thanks to those of you who are tuning in from different time zones, because you care about the people of Iran, and you care about all the people of Iran with all the diversity that Iran offers. As a previous panelist indicated, those of us who are monitoring and watching what is happening in Iran know about the persecution that is happening to our people, not just to the religious minorities, but also everybody else. The Islamic Republic of Iran considers itself a religious entity, a religious government, and there is no separation between the government and state. As such, religion is used to implement the good and the bad and the ugly amongst the people. Religion is used as an excuse for cruelty against the people. Religion is used as an explanation for people suffering, or as a source of consolation for people suffering from poverty, hunger, and policies that the government has imposed on the people. Religion is being used as a way to separate people, to create division and hatred among people. Religion is being used as an instructional force in schools, and not one that brings people together, but one that actually instills fear and suspicion between school children. So, and the main culprit in all of this is the Constitution of the Islamic Republic that lays out a systemic plan that implements an institutional format for discrimination and persecution. And hopefully we will get to talk more about all of this.
Absolutely. Thank you all. I mean, the events you described, I think are so difficult for us who live in the United States, the United Kingdom, the West, to fathom. I think there's a really strong propaganda and machine, really, of those abroad, those from the Islamic Republic who make this regime out to be any other state, imperfect but improving. But what you're describing, what each of you have just described, just in this introduction, I mean, is really a fascist religious state, which is incomparable to most any other example that we have today. So I think it's very important for our audience to understand just how severe this is, and just as a reminder, these punishments, these crimes we're speaking of, they are because somebody has a particular faith or practices a particular faith, and for no other reason, which is simply shocking. I'd like to ask each of you, given the understanding and the knowledge that you have of the different communities inside Iran, those that you focus on specifically, I know that we'll discuss all of them. What are some of the tactics that the Islamic Republic uses to persecute or to intimidate people of particular communities? Marjan, if you wouldn't mind starting us off, what are some of the tactics used against, for example, the Baha'i community, the Jewish community in the Islamic Republic's 40-year reign, again, as forms of intimidation or persecution?
So since you mentioned the Baha'i community, let me just start here with an overall introduction. I think since we don't have a representative of the Baha'i community, maybe we can all add the gaps here. So the Islamic Republic really began with an intense persecution of the people of the Baha'i faith. So let me just step back and explain that while there is a constitution, and the constitution does recognize the so-called people of the book with certain rights and privileges, and those groups being Jews, Zoroastrians, and Christians, it has left a significant segment of the population off the grid without any rights, without any recognition of where they belong in the society. But, and definitely the Baha'i community was among the neglected population that did not have a position in the Iranian constitution, not even as second-class citizens. So in that situation, you know, not only they had to deal with an undesignated non-identity in the society, but also they had to deal with multiple fatwas that were initiated, that were issued against them, that deemed them as impure, as improper, and encouraged Muslims to have distancing, not social distancing, but really societal and cultural distancing from members of the Baha'i faith, to apply economic strangulation, limiting their abilities to make a living, to limit their access to higher education, which is an important tenet of their religion, and to also really, and create an environment that has led to what has become known as a situation of cradle to grave discrimination, meaning a Baha'i person from the moment of birth is limited with the rights to identity, to free exercise of their faith, later on with access to higher education, later on with employment, later on with setting up their own businesses, from socializing, etc., etc. So this is a significant problem, to create an otherism format where one segment of the population is vilified and regarded as untouchable. It is like a caste system, and everybody is right now re-examining their caste system. But since 40 years ago, the Islamic Republic has embraced this new caste system that puts some people on the bottom or even off the grid completely. In terms of the tactics, these are some of the tactics that I've mentioned. Right to assembly, right to and this is, by the way, a right that is also deprived of others. Every religious institution needs to register with the government. The members often have to identify themselves. The books for the prayer books have to be approved by the Islamic Republic. The religious instruction cannot be in their own language. So even with the second-class citizens, even with the population that is officially recognized by the Constitution, the rights are still limited, and the practice of religion is significantly controlled.
Thank you very much, Marjan, and especially for giving us an insight into the particular focus this regime appears to have on the Baha'i community. Hamid, would you mind giving us some insight on what specific tactics or what sort of means the Islamic Republic uses to persecute the Gonabadi Sufi community? As you mentioned so eloquently, and we'll get back to this, it's important to understand and discuss the fact that the entire Iranian nation faces significant discrimination and persecution. But what, as a religious minority, as a group on which the Islamic Republic focuses on, specifically, what has the regime done to the Gonabadi Sufi community to persecute them?
Well, generally, one of the tactics of this regime, not just for Gonabadi Sufi, first thing I'd like to mention is that they have created this false narrative, this claim that Iran is over 95% Shia Muslim, which is a blatant lie. And they're portraying themselves as the representative of the vast majority of the people in Iran. There are over 20 million Sunnis, 8 to 10 million Gonabadi Sufis, which they do not consider as Muslims. So that's 40% of the population right there, not considering the rest of so-called religious minorities. And I really, really do not like this term minority. That's their tactic. They divide and conquer. And every minority has been labeled as an agent of foreign powers with the aim of overthrowing the regime. So they use these divisive tactics, propaganda. They have extensively used it against Gonabadi Sufis. In our case, early on, from the onset of this regime, the theoreticians of this regime, people like Saeed Emami, proclaimed Gonabadi Sufis and Sufism as the single most dangerous threat to this regime, ideological threat to this regime, because our worldview and practice of Islam causes doubts and questions in the minds of Basijis and Sepahis, whom the regime has spent enormous amount of effort and resources to brainwash. And they decided to eradicate Gonabadi Sufis early on. Even during Khomeini's time, they ransacked our place of worship in Tehran, burned it down, and it started destruction, murders, as I said, stripping them off of every civil right to education, right to having business, work, and so forth. And it's done through by two means. One is division, negative propaganda, and judiciary has a big role, plays a big role in this, and decrease fatwas by ayatollahs. For example, Nouri Hamedani, Safi Golpaigani, and the likes of them have issued decrees calling Gonabadi Sufis Mahduruddam, which means you're encouraged, you're allowed to spill their blood because the non-Muslims, they're blasphemous version of Islam and so forth. And we have been called American and British version of Islam, creation of American and British version to weaken the position of clerics in Iran. And the other means is their agents within each community. The Gonabadi Sufis, for example, the late Dr. Nur Ali Tabande was murdered at the hands of 4 of the agents within Sufi community. And tragically, the leader of this group was Dr. Tabande's own nephew by the name of Muhammad Tabande, with the help of a mullah named Hossein Ali Kashani and 2 other agents, Harsini and Mir Yunus Jafari, who had been planted within the Sufi community for decades. And they create divisions and doubts, and they carry on the wishes of their masters. But this is not specific to Gonabadi Sufis alone. I mean, there's really questionable statements by the representative of the Jewish community, for example, the only representative in the parliament, Mr. Meresot, said, praising Khamenei and his regime for being so benevolent and criticizing Israel as a Zionist regime that should be eradicated. So these are the methods they use. The situation for Baha'is is different because they're not considered people of the book. But even that's a lie, because in Quran, Mandavis, the followers of John the Baptist, are considered people of the book, one of the Abrahamic religions. But they don't have any rights or even acknowledgement in this regime's constitution. And the issue of constitution and laws and decrees is something that it's a very powerful tool to keep us busy, always in reactive mode. They can always change it. For example, they added Articles 499 and 500 to Volume 5 of the Islamic Penal Code, enabling the regime to brand anybody, any entity, as a sect. So they can be punished, and it can be as severe as death penalty, giving them open hands. So we are always playing catch up, reacting to the new laws, to the new issues that they bring up, new decrees by regimes ayatollahs. I believe our approach should be different.
Thank you, and we'll be sure as we go forward to get back to that approach and what you see as a solution for this. Mansour, would you mind answering the same question and giving us your view on what are the tactics, what are the methods that the Islamic Republic uses to persecute Christians? I imagine many of them overlap with some of the things that both Hamid and Marjan mentioned. But please, the floor is yours.
Yes, I think I very much agree with what the other panelists mentioned, the divide and conquer kind of approach to the population, and as I said, to organized groups, which means religious communities in this case. It's been the case. They have implemented their policies through surveillance, through harassment of effective community members. In terms of Christians, they've tried suffocating growth by either minimizing or restricting freedom to assembly, or gathering. They've tried to stop the Christian publications such as Bible or Christian literature or Christian education, in a sense. Denial of education and employment. These are other tactics that use either as preventative or incentive to those who collaborate with them in one way or another. And also agree with the fact that using different categorization of the population as those who completely agree or go with the regime's interpretation of what they consider justice or acceptable or lawful, and then branding everyone else with different labels that it's from the beginning of the Islamic Revolution in 1979 until today. It's been used as liberals, deviants, conspirators, anti-revolutionaries, and now for religious communities, they just produce these brands and labelings, call them deviants. In terms of Christians, they call them Zionists, which are incredibly inflammatory and clear examples of hate speech, which I think the world should get have Iran accountable, because these words produce crimes against humanity, the outcome of it now and also in the future. So we shouldn't really take those as just empty words, but they have serious practical implications and the livelihood of people now and in the future. So eliminating church leaders. We just hours ago published another update on the Assyrian Iranian pastor Victor Bet Tamraz and his wife Shamira Misavi, who are clear examples of this sort of cases, eliminating effective leadership in these religious communities, whereby they were sentenced to 15 years in prison because of their church activities, although they were Christian, from Christian families or Christian background, Syrian background, but nevertheless, because they sought to share their faith with others, and they were subject of harassment. Their church was shut down in 2009, and he was arrested in 2015. Because he held a Christmas celebration in his home, inviting people who were now churchless. They didn't have anywhere else to come together for a religious ceremony. So these are clear examples of how the Iranian authorities try to eliminate those who do not propagate their revolutionary ideology or do not go with what they see permissible.
Thank you, and I'd like to ask you a follow-up there, Mansour. I'd like to read a quote, if it's okay, and this is from the former head of the Islamic Republic's quote-unquote Supreme Court, Mohammad Gilani, who said that, quote, the punishment for a Murtad Fitri or an apostate, somebody who was born into a Muslim family and is an apostate, changes their religion, is death, and his repentance is not accepted. You just referred to the fact that there are, and Hamid mentioned this as well, there are some representatives of many of these faiths in Iran. There are Armenian Christians. They are reserved some seats in parliament. Mr. Gharagozloo referenced the Jewish representative in the parliament. Can you describe for us this sort of dichotomy between the fact these groups that the regime often holds up to say, look, we indeed have Christians, but on the other hand, having the death penalty for apostasy or the arrest of those who are proselytizing that you just mentioned, that I think isn't always clear. The regime's propaganda of we have Christians, we have Jewish representatives. You see this very frequently. There was a PBS article a few months ago that I recall saying just how great life is for the Jewish community, for example, in Iran. But would you mind elaborating for us on that?
Sure, and that's a really important question that we frequently get from those who see what the Iranian government is trying to portray. Obviously, the image is very important for them, so therefore they have representatives of these faith communities, so-called representatives, to constantly speak using their platforms, saying that they have all the rights they're enjoying all the rights and no restrictions. But the fact of the matter is, if you ask the very members of the parliament who usually are the spokespersons for this sort of propaganda, whether you can apply for a presidential election, they would say no, because I'm a religious minority and therefore by constitution I'm disallowed. So that's the first step. Then you get on to education, employment, and you can list a huge number of restrictions that they face. So while there are some Christians in Iran that remain one of the constitutionally recognized religious minorities, the Iranian regime's definition of Christians does not extend to, first of all, those who are converts to Christianity, or secondly, to those who are born into Christian families but seek to share their faith with others. And these are the examples that I just mentioned of Victor and others who can face long imprisonment because of their interactions with these groups. Now, when it comes to converts to Christianity, it's no secret that Iran is has one of the fastest growing Christian population in terms of conversion to Christianity. But I think that's much been highlighted in the media. What we do not acknowledge is a huge number of people that are distancing themselves from religion altogether, and from some conversion to other faiths also occur. That is not reported very frequently in media. So if you take the quotes from some of these revolutionary figures, half, if I'm not exaggerating, and if we're more realistic, probably 70–80% of the Iranian population with that categorization are converts or are apostates. Are you going to execute all those people? Obviously not, for several reasons. One, Iran does care about its international image and reputation, and therefore that's a reason that at least since 2010, we have rarely seen the charges of apostasy brought to Christian converts. It's mostly used. The mostly used charges are actions against national security or propaganda against the state. But one of the other reasons, in addition to how they try to portray themselves as a democratic regime, is the different variations of Islamic ruling or Shia ruling on the issue of apostasy. So we have grand ayatollahs that have different fatwas or religious verdicts for apostasy. Some see it punishable, others do not see the punishment this worldly. They think if somebody has done this out of even animosity, this should be something that will be judged by God and not a state here. So because of this different variation in Islamic Shia ruling, it's not really making sense to put it in the penal code. That's an attempt that they tried to do in 2008, failed, first because of international outcry, secondly because there was no consensus even among Shia clergy. I hope that does explain.
No, it does. Thank you. And it's interesting to see the regime's shift in tactics from directly trying people for apostasy, executing them for apostasy, to using other tactics, as you said, crimes against the state, national security, spying, etc. I'd like to continue that with Hamid and ask you a question. This is a quote, if I may, from Ruhollah Khomeini, who is the leader of the Islamic Revolution. He's quoted as saying that, quote, Baha'i is not a religion, it is a political party. It is a party that was initially supported by the British and is now supported by America. They are spies, end quote. Now you could copy and paste Baha'i with any of the groups that we're talking today and really the Iranian nation. This is a clear, in my view, attempts to make these groups out to be enemies. It's a clear violation of international law. Obviously, you have a wealth of experience working with the United States Department of State and other governments in your capacity as the US representative. How seriously do international organizations, does the United States government take issues like this? And what have they done? What can we see? What can we expect to see going forward? I think we've seen lots of statements, but with crimes on this level, can we expect to see more action be taken, more accountability brought to this regime for these crimes?
Well, yes, I mean, the current US administration, and especially the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, takes these issues very, very seriously under the leadership of Ambassador Brownback. And we do report these atrocities against all Iranians to them. And they do take it very seriously. They issue statements and they demand accountability from the officials of the regime. And these efforts by all of us, by all Iranians, have been instrumental in putting pressure and sanctions on the regime, increasing the pressure and sanctions. And this is something that should be continued. We should, and that's upon us, the Iranian diaspora, to increase this pressure in every country that we live in, demand it from the politicians, the leaders, to confront this regime and put as much pressure on them as possible. So yes, it is. They do take it serious, and our efforts, collective efforts, have been very, very instrumental. They're very aware of the genocide and crimes that are going on in Iran. At this point, I believe because of desperation of the regime, image is not that important for them. And they have means. I mean, they created these laws and they changed the charges, but they keep on executing and oppressing people. The level of oppression and arrests and death sentences, especially among the Sunni community, has gone drastically up. With Ibrahim Raisi as the head of the judiciary, the person that is responsible for murder of over 30,000 political prisoners and dissidents. And one of the first things he did was that he issued a directive that harvesting the organs and body parts of these prisoners, political prisoners, people who are going to be executed, is not only legal, but the best way to redeem them for their crimes. This is the nature of the beast. I mean, and it's not specific, as I said again, this is not specific to a specific religious group. Political dissidents. I mean, Nasrin Sotoudeh, what category should we put her in? Narges Mohammadi, Hashim Khastar, Mohammad Nouriza, Arash Sadeqi, Sohail Arabi, Atana Daimi, Sepide Gholian. I mean, thousands of them. We have to be their voice. And I humbly ask the Iranian diaspora, a population of 5 million, to set aside our differences, unite and help our people, our nation. This nation, vast majority of it, over 70% of it, was born as a victim of this regime. They were either children at the time or they were born after the revolution. They did not have anything with bringing this regime to power. They were born as victims of it. And they deserve our help. They deserve our attention. This struggle is going to continue forever. Unless this regime is changed. They can play with us, they can issue new laws, new decrees, and we can react to them. Or we can be proactive, take action and help our nation to reclaim and take their country back.
Very much. Marjan, I'd like to ask you one question before getting to one more general question, and then we'll go to audience questions. We've already received several, so please, before we get to the end of this event, please, if you have questions for our panelists, please send them using the Q&A function on the bottom of Zoom. If you're watching us again live on YouTube, please leave your questions in the comment section or on Twitter, and we'll get to them shortly. And Marjan, one thing that has perhaps been a result of an amalgamation of factors, specifically referring to the Jewish community, has been the fact that this community has been depopulated by 90%. I mean, before the Islamic Revolution, there was a significant Jewish population, and now that has been decreased significantly. What has been what has caused this? And have there been a variety of factors? What is this? This is something I don't see referred to frequently, but just mathematically, it boggles the mind, really, such a decrease.
So to put this into context, I think it all comes in full circle. One of the number one reasons, one of the number one charges against religious minorities when they're arrested is, you know, national security threats or charges of espionage. And even when a persecuted religious minority group or leader is reporting the persecution to outside entities, this is considered an act of espionage. And that can have significant consequences. You know, this is a very scary, very significant charge, especially for someone of a minority faith who already doesn't have a lot of resources, a lot of powers. So the charge of espionage is a very heavy charge. The charge of national security threat is a very significant charge. And basically it is coming from this notion that your alternative views are threatening our beliefs. That if you have alternative views, you should either change them or just not talk about them. And this is why they try to keep the religious minority groups separate from one another. And that is also a reason why they don't want any kind of house churches, private gatherings, any public forums, or, you know, or underground educational forum, etc. Because they don't want these ideas to go out, because it threatens their principles and their beliefs. So what we have noticed is that the Sunni community is very outspoken about the persecution they're experiencing. And by the way, you know, the Sunni persecution is most visible across the ethnic lines of the country, in the peripheral towns, you know, bordering bordering Iran with its neighbors. And we can discuss that. We should discuss that in a few more sentences later. And we see from the Baha'i population, because of the significant support on an international level from the community, there is reporting. There is from the Gonabari Darwish community. The Christians have reporting, but with the Jewish community, we do not see any reports of persecution. It's very, very, very rare. Like right now, there is one 60-year-old gentleman in prison because of a Jewish gentleman is in prison because of alleged travel to the state of Israel. But by and large, the Jewish community is very silent. They are very strong with their advocacy and support for the regime. Even yesterday, there was a very powerful, very damning statement from the Jewish community condemning the new treaty between Israel and the UAE. And in the most forceful language, they condemned this treaty, and they stood for the Palestinian people. So the Jewish community does not complain, but what we're saying is that quietly the population is leaving the country. The population is dwindling down. You can draw your own conclusions about why they're doing that, but there is definitely a difference between the forceful rhetoric, and verbal support of the regime, and also their desire to leave the country. You can draw your own conclusions.
As they say, they're voting with their feet, as it were. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask one brief question, which Ms. Keypour, you just answered it, I believe, but I'd like to give others, just if you want to add more, and a brief add-on, and then a second part of the question, if the panelists would like to, and if they don't want to, that's fine. Why does the regime do this? I mean, I think for the average person who tries to think logically, who tries to think humanely, it seems incomprehensible. There's a difference between groups that are actively political and they're trying to say cause changes in a regime, and the regime acts brutally towards them, that is equally inexcusable. We see that with equal force, and it's shameful. But these groups, I mean, these people are in a totally separate box, if you will. They're practicing their faith, they're sharing their faith. You mentioned sort of the ideological threats, Marjan. Is that it? Why does the regime do this to people just because of a belief they hold? That's the first. And the second part, if you'd like to answer, how do we stop this? Is it international pressure? Is it changing the regime? Is that the only way? Again, you don't have to answer if you don't like, but that's, I think, is a question a lot of people have. How do we stop these crimes? Marjan, I'll give it to you first.
Listen, it's very easy to say God wants you to do this or that, and the law of the land here is the word of God. It is very easy to sway people to follow certain order, to be controlled, to put up with hardship, to put up with wars, to put up with hunger. It's very easy to do that when the justification for all of this is the word of God. But if your religious belief is telling you something, or your political beliefs or your social beliefs and ideologies are telling you something that is disagreeing with the interpretation of what your God is telling everybody else, then the order that they were hoping for just falls apart. This pillars of stability that they were hoping to maintain by going to the highest power in the world, and the supernatural power of the world. When that is questioned, then they cannot do what they want to do. They cannot pursue their other objectives. And this is not just for religion, as we know it is for also ideologies. They even, they were arresting yoga practitioners. They were torturing yoga practitioners in prison to the point of paralysis. Why is a yoga practitioner who is by nature, by principle, based on peaceful ideology, why is that creating such threat? As for what is the solution, I think that as Mr. Gharagozloo mentioned, the Trump administration is applying a policy of maximum pressure, and that is having, its consequences. In some ways, we see that when there are watchful eyes abroad, the regime is more likely to watch what they do. Take, for example, the massive no execution campaign for the 3 young men that was launched about a month ago, and that basically spared at least temporarily has saved the lives of those individuals. We have to recognize also that while the board was focused on the lives of those 3 individuals, they went and executed a whole bunch of other people whose names did not get that level of publicity. So that is actually a note for us as activists and as diaspora supporters to keep a broad perspective as to what's happening, and not just have a single issue focus for our own little silos. So but by and large, having a watchful eye of diaspora and international community definitely helps. Holding Iran accountable to the principles and the treaties that they have signed on to, that helps, and they have to be reminded of it again and again and again. So, but in terms of what is the internal solution for the country, I think that is best decided by the people. And as long as we're able to hear them, as long as the line of communications are open, the internet lines are open, and we can hear what's going on, we can amplify what the people want, but the desire has to be expressed and come from the population itself.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gharagozloo. Please.
Thank you. Well, as to the question of why this regime does that, it's because they know the foundation of this regime is based on a very, very fragile concept that has an expiration date. anybody after a while realizes the insanity and falsity of their claims. So that's what we're witnessing. They don't have any base of support in any segment of society anymore in Iran. And as far as what we should do, what should be done, in my opinion, the reality, people of Iran have risen numerous times bravely, and they were massacred. It's not that they don't want to. It's not that they're not willing to or able to. The issue is the supporters of Khamenei and his regime. Russia, China, Europeans who have consistently stabbed Iranian people in the back. Without their support, this regime would not be in existence today. 12, 13 years ago, at the onset of the Green Movement, this regime would have been gone if it weren't for the support and statements of President Obama. And this was accomplished by very few handful of lobbyists within US. Vali Nasr, his father, Said Hossein Nasr, Hushang Amir Ahmadi, Trita Parsi. That's a lesson for us, the Iranian diaspora. We should stand together and accomplish the same thing, but for the people of Iran, not against people of Iran. We have to create this environment where these foreign powers that are feeding off of Iran, that have been feeding off of Iran and Iranian people for 40 years, can back off at least temporarily. And that creates the chance, the opportunity, and the environment for Iranian people to rise and take their country back. This regime is at its weakest. It's in a lose-lose situation. Its tentacles all over the region are being cut off. People of Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, they're fed up, they're tired, and they want change. The same as people of Iran. But the reality is that the source of all these miseries, genocides, is the regime in Iran. And if the supporters are cut off, then people of Iran can take care of it themselves.
Thank you very much. Mr. Borji, I'll give you the floor for this last bit. No, you're on mute, sorry.
I have to make it just very brief, but stick with your question about why is this happening and how could this be justified. I think the answer is very clear. Every Friday in Iran, every Friday prayer you go, you hear them shouting death, mag bar zidd velayat faqih, death to those who are opposing the guardianship of the jurist. This is guardianship of the jurist was a theory that the founder of this regime introduced, and that is a supreme leader has a total control, unaccountable to any other authority, and whoever goes against this is eliminated in one way or another, or brought to submission. So since the beginning of the Islamic Revolution, anybody who does not make this, acknowledge this pillar of the Islamic regime is eliminated, whether it's a political entity or as a religious group. If this regime, call it dictatorial, call it authoritarian, finds the cohesion and the glue that brings all the members of the society together, this very principle, submission to the guardianship of jurists, we as members of religious minorities or groups, or even those within their own ranks that have a varying opinion about this guardianship of jurists, have to be eliminated. So therefore, we are seen as unwanted or undesirable entities, and that makes sense. And it's not my own interpretation. You just have to go back in 2010, Ayatollah Khomeini's address in the city of Qom, which he clearly described how he sees the two pillars that the regime stands on, and how he clearly mentions three things: the Baha'i faith, house church Christian networks, and also what he calls false mysticism. which we have addressed those three here today in this panel. He's seen those, he named those clearly as threatening the foundation of the Islamic regime. And that's why we see the courts, right after his speech, use the statements like actions against national security to condemn those who are arrested because of their religious activities.
Thank you very much. We've received many questions. I'll try to get to just 2 or 3 of them, and I'll direct them to each panelist. If you could try and be very brief in your response, I apologize. You were all such experts, and your comments are all so interesting that we're short on time. We're pushing up on our 1-hour mark. The first question I'll address to you, Marjan. You referenced the fatwas that are given by this regime. One of our guests has asked, in a system like the Islamic Republic, in which the laws and the state are based on this version of Sharia law, are there any differences between a fatwa and a law that is actually passed by the systems of this regime? What effect does a fatwa have?
My colleagues can also weigh in, but my understanding of a fatwa is that it's a religious order of significance and one that has to be obeyed. Many of us, heard the word fatwa. Maybe many of the Western audiences heard the word fatwa for the first time. When Salman Rushdie came out with his book, and there was a fatwa on his life, and so he had to take that very seriously and live with full security. Last time we heard about fatwa was Curb Your Enthusiasm, but that's a different story. But nonetheless, fatwas are a very serious phenomenon, and they have to be taken very seriously. People with fatwas on them, they have a legitimate fear for their lives, and social fatwas with day-to-day interactions have absolute significance on, if not the practice, but definitely the opinion of the population.
Thank you very much. Hamid, one of the questions is asked, is what you refer to seemingly as the way to end these problems are regime change? This is what you said in your statement. One question asks, is that feasible? Is that actually possible? I think that's a question a lot of people have when it comes to this topic in Iran.
I believe so, much more than we imagine. The nation is ready. It's been ready. The regime is at its weakest. And if the policies of President Trump continues and other nations join in, and again, the Iranian diaspora can play a vital role in making this happen, putting pressure on their host countries and their politicians to join in confronting this regime and put the lives and livelihoods of Iranians before the economic gains that they get from dealing with this regime. Then we can create that space, that opportunity for people of Iran to rise.
Thank you very much. And Mansour, one of the questions is regarding the relationship between people of different faiths. You've all referred to, I think, quite correctly and quite nobly, the necessity of all groups, despite whatever faith or I know Mr. Gharagozloo does not like the term, but minority status they may have, coming together. I mean, that's what's been so unique about Iran for millennia, is how diverse the country is, but everyone is part of this broader Iranian nation. This question refers to the interplay or the interaction between people of different faiths. Do you see a time in Iran's future, perhaps as it was in the past, when people of different faiths, if there is a regular legal structure, not like the one we see with this regime, where people will be able to live in peace between one another, despite differences of their faiths?
I think we're human rights activists, and human rights activists live with the hope that these very distant dreams will one day become a reality. I share with Martin Luther King Jr. that I have that dream, and I hope that one day I will see it, although he didn't get to see a lot of the fruits of his activism. But we have to be realistic that we have 40 years of division and this intolerant ideology being pumped into population through years of education in their system. But nevertheless, I think the fact that we're here, and I think we, in most of the cases, we agreed together with people who hold different religious views, that's a good start. And I think there's, although the Iranian regime has tried to represent a very intolerant view of other faith groups, the general public have grown to in their tolerance of other views. So the name of our organization's Article 18 refers to the Article 18 of the International Civil and Political Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, which is about freedom to believe and even not to believe. So if we accept each other and there are a right to have varying religious views or not have one at all, I think that's a good start, and I hope to see that dream fulfilled one day.
I hope so as well. I know we all here share that. I would like to just say, before I bring on Mr. Shahpar Azam, who is the Vice Chair of NUFDI, to close us out, I would just like to, again, thank all of you for your time today. I know that I can't imagine, really, I shouldn't say I know, I can't imagine the toll that this work takes on you, how tiring it is, but each of you referred to the importance of those abroad being the voice of those inside and relaying their voices. And I thank you personally on behalf of NUFDI as well for the work that you have done in ensuring that as the regime tries to silence people inside Iran, that their voices are heard. On behalf of NUFDI, I can say that we'll continue to do the same. It's really been a pleasure for us to host you. I hope we'll be able to collaborate in the future. Many people in the comments in Zoom and Twitter and YouTube have asked how they can work with you. So we'll be sure to share information about each of your groups thereafter. I think the more collaboration, the better. There are fantastic groups from IOPHR to ARAM to Article 18, which the three of you represent. Many more as well in Washington and around the world doing this great work. So thank you again. I'd like to bring on Mr. Azam for one moment to just thank you all and to close us out for today. Mr. Azam, when you are in, we'll unmute you. Mr. Azam, can you hear us? I think we should be able to hear you.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, let's. Do you want to have your video on? Or just asked. You can turn your video on. And you can close us out. There we go. We got you.
Kamran, thank you so much for organizing this webinar. On behalf of NUFDI, I certainly would like to thank our panelists. Great passion, great energy, and thank you for your efforts. Without you guys out there really exposing the crime and human rights violations of the Iranian regime, a lot of things would not happen. And thank you for everything you've done. I also like to thank all the participants in this webinar. And encourage really everyone to encourage their friends to join in. This is many of these type of dialogue and webinars and gatherings that we like to see participation from the Iranian community all over the world to join us. At NUFDI, we're committed to really do whatever we can and do our share to help facilitate and support the efforts of the Iranian people to really gain their rights. It's every human right to be able to practice their religion. This issue is very personal and dear to me personally. And, when I see a regime that doesn't allow a young person to continue their formal education so they can become a beneficial individual for their country. It really is very heartbreaking and disturbing how gross these violations are. So again, thank you. Join us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, so you will hear about all of the events that we're doing and be informed. And you know, there's a saying that they say that there is, as long as there are victims, there will be crimes. You know, we need to refuse to be a victim. And the only way we can, by being a voice and let the world know what is happening in Iran and what's going on in Iran, because otherwise these crimes and human rights violations will continue forever. So it's up to us, as Mr. Gharagozloo mentioned, to really put an end to it. And the sooner we begin participating fully, the sooner this will go away. Thank you again, and have a great day.
Thank you again, Mr. Razdan. Again, thank you on behalf of NUFDI to all of the panelists in our inaugural web forum. We'll continue to have more of these. We continue to hope to have the pleasure of working with all of you. Thank you to everyone for attending as panelists and our participants all across the web, and we'll hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. If I may, one short statement. All of us together are infinitely more than the sum of our parts. We should realize this. And thank you. God bless.
Absolutely. Thank you all.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Bye-bye.